On the way to the fifth hold, Falagrim's forces caught up to the trailing fringes of the Council's forces. They consisted of novice soldiers with poor conditioning, the injured still awaiting their turn for healing, and the clansmen who stayed behind with them. As the undead came closer, they stopped to take up hasty defensive positions in the buildings lining the street. Falagrim stepped forward and raised his voice. "You know the drill," his words carried down the street. "You're either labor, or you're entertainment." He didn't stop to see what their response was, though the human looked as if she was about to cry as the dwarves threw down their weapons. "I know how you feel," Velgarth said in conciliatory tones. "But we don't have time to enjoy ourselves." "Huh? No. That's not what I..." Hopefully, the human girl wouldn't be too bad of an influence on his daughter. "My prince," a grey robe walked up beside him. The psionic interference in the area is dissipating. Have you any orders? Are things clear enough for telepathy? Falagrim asked. Not enough to communicate ahead of our advance, the grey robe answered. Everything behind us, however. Search for any Feelhammer holdouts that we might have missed, Falagrim said. Organize them the same way as before, but keep any new military forces back to maintain order instead of catching up with us. I hear and obey. Life wouldn't just magically become worry-free after the council was removed from Feelhammer, so roughly half of their liberated clansmen went straight back to work even as fighting continued across the principality. Critical industries needed to be restarted and the clan's logistics network had to be restored or their momentum against their enemies would falter. When they arrived at the fifth hold, they found Daerga Deepingstone waiting for them. He was seated on a stone bench at the bottom of the hold's main approach, tearing away at a haunch of roast nook. The freshly taken heads of 6 dwarves dangled from his belts by their beards, creating a pool of blood on the pavement. Falagrim leaned slightly to get a better look at one of them. Isn't that? Daerga reached down with his free hand and held the head up by the black quarrel still buried in its forehead. The human dashed off to empty her stomach. Yup, he said. Prince Shalegrinder. One of his people insulted one of my people once about 70 years ago, so I figured I'd return the favor. Where did you find him? Harder Bridge, Daerga said. Looks like they were responsible for maintaining the lines going out of there. We found this guy when we took the gatehouse, and now my people are harrying his clan between here and Harder. Easy pickings with them stretched out like that. Got plenty of our people coming back. Good, Falagrim nodded. We'll be securing Harder Gate eventually, but don't overdo it. Any idea where the council's keeping all of their heavy hitters? I'm not sure whether the clans sent that many at all. It wasn't that sort of campaign in the first place. If there are any, they should be with the council's main army. When considering the big picture, keeping the strongest members of the clans at home was the most prudent move. As Daerga had mentioned, the campaign against Clan Feelhammer demanded broad force projection. All they needed was to bring enough powerful individuals to keep those of Clan Feelhammer in check. Any external threats to Khazan-Ar that required an army to defend against would be detected far in advance, and threats that required heroes to defeat would hit too hard and too fast unless a defender was already present. Similarly, if additional heroes were needed in Feelhammer, it wouldn't take anywhere as long to bring them over as it would an army. And then there was the fact that putting powerful people from different clans within spitting distance of one another was a recipe for disaster. Heroes tended to develop a complex about their strength and friction tended to result between them if they were left to their own devices. The last thing the council needed was random duels between Khazan-Ar's most powerful individuals happening in the middle of their invasion of Feelhammer. And what is the council's main army doing? They didn't come running over to secure their only way off of Feelhammer, Daerga said, so our moves to cut off their lines of communication have probably worked. Meaning that the council's armies continued to do whatever they were doing. Falagrim considered how he would approach his remaining enemies. As he had suspected, the council had maintained their siege of Feelhammer Citadel with a small force while they dispatched the other armies to stop the undead. That besieging force had been reinforced by the remnants of the armies that had withdrawn from the underway exit. A breach had already been made sometime before their arrival. Since they didn't see them anywhere else, he assumed that the heroes the council had brought with them were spearheading that assault. This meant the battle was probably already over. Additionally, somewhere on the opposite side of the citadel was the other half of the council's remaining strength. They were still too far away for reports detailing their numbers and positioning to arrive, but they could arrive at any point to cause trouble for Falagrim's siege of his own citadel. While Falagrim was reasonably confident of victory, his current dilemma had to do with the various outcomes that would result from his actions. Half of Fylhammer was still occupied, and, if he played things poorly, it was possible that the council forces would give up on victory and butcher their captives out of spite. That represented a substantial hit to the economy, which was to be avoided if possible. My prince. He looked up to find a newly arrived scout. Report from Fylhammer Citadel. Let's hear it. The councils finished moving all their forces and supplies into the citadel. Falagrim narrowed his eyes at the massive stalactite that loomed over the center of the principality several kilometers away. Even given what they surely knew by now, the commander-in-chief of the council forces still insisted on taking up a defensive position. Were they that confident of their ability to hold the undead off, or had they decided that they couldn't escape over Harder Bridge in time? Change of plans, he said. We'll ignore the citadel for now. We're sweeping the remaining council forces in the city into the citadel along with their friends. Daerga, find us our quarry. Yes, my prince. The Lord of Deepingstone turned to address his officers. Set up pickets all along Harder Way. No council stooge crosses over to our side. Send up a signal if there are any major attempts at a breakthrough. We'll fly some reinforcements over. Want us to tighten things up behind the main force as they advance? One of the officers asked. No, maintain those positions, Daerga told them. Our forces aren't large enough to cover the width of Fylhammer, so the undead are bouncing all over the place. I've seen those lesser graveyards do their thing a few times now, you don't want to get caught up in that. Daerga's forces dispersed, vanishing into the darkness in every direction. There hadn't even been a dozen present, but Falagrim knew that the entire clan would be aware of their lord's orders before long. After briefing the defenders of the fifth hold, Falagrim headed toward Harder Way. Daerga's deep wardens had long since taken their positions and an officer jogged up to make his report as soon as Falagrim started crossing the ancient thoroughfare. We found them, my prince, she said with a salute. They're coming toward the citadel along the north side, halfway between the western column and the cliffs. Numbers? About the same that was sent to hold you at the other underway entrance. They'll arrive at the citadel in 6 hours. That's quick, Daerga raised an eyebrow. Did they set up some sort of relay to get information back and forth? Fylhammer was just over 40 kilometers from end to end, so having an army on the opposite side of the principality react within a day of Iron Fist's forces being routed was indeed quick. Unfortunately for them, he was much faster. We'll ambush them 2 hours out from the citadel, Falagrim said. Put out any eyes they've sent ahead of themselves. The zombie forces will not be available at your proposed interception point, an Elder Lich sergeant noted. That's fine, Falagrim said. We don't need the coverage. They're already setting themselves up nicely for us. Call in the Elder Liches. Have them bring their summons along. 4 hours later, Falagrim patiently waited at the intersection directly between Fylhammer Citadel and the approaching army. Of course, they were so numerous that, when they appeared, it was not just from the street directly in front of him, but a half-dozen to the north and south, as well. They quickly moved to encircle him and the 2 country destroyer sets at his back. A woman's voice boomed from the other side of the intersection. Stand down and accept your punishment, Grimmantle traitor. Apparently, they still had no idea what they were up against. Maybe they should have put more effort into advertising who was laying the council low. He didn't like it when others received credit for his work. I don't believe I know that voice, Falagrim said. I think that's the debutante from Clan Gloomgranite, Daerga told him. Debutante? Falagrim frowned. What's someone like that doing leading half of the council's forces? She's supposed to be some once-in-a-generation strategic genius. It's not saying much considering the quality of Khazanar's opponents recently, but she has a flawless 20-year war record. That so? Well, then. Falagrim raised his voice in response. I have a proposal for you, Iligar, Daerga supplied. Iligar. Heligar. The woman shouted back. Whatever, Falagrim said. Become my son's concubine or you die like everyone else. Huh? Have you gone crazy, you? He turned his back on the woman's furious screeching. Scour this filth from my streets. Helagar's voice trailed off as an unsettling clattering sound came from above. Then, the combined shouts of 100,000 dark dwarves rose into the air as they were buried in a flood of bones. If they're called lesser graveyards, Felagrim muttered, then why do they fly? Because they are supposed to, one of the elder lich sergeants replied. The damned things didn't even have wings. Things were just like that sometimes, he supposed. 10 minutes later, the lesser boneyards flew off again. Felagrim strolled over to the other side of the intersection. The street was paved with the bodies of boneless dwarves, stretching beyond the range of his dark vision. Rivulets of blood joined into torrents that flowed down the gutter running down the center of the road. I'm sure there's a business opportunity in this somewhere, he said. I prefer my meat on the bone, Daerga said, but you may be onto something. So, just the citadel left, huh? There's still harder after that, Felagrim replied. We also probably have days of council reinforcements still en route. That'll be child's play for your new undead friends. What I'm asking is what you plan on doing in the long term. That depends on what we learn. Regardless, we'll have to get everything up and running again and finish up Aowen's original plan. Beyond the possible reasons why the council was absurdly over-prepared for Clan Fielhammer's move to cut itself off from the rest of Khazar, he hadn't thought too deeply about the far future. All of his time and energy had been focused on systematically eradicating the vermin infesting his home and getting their domestic affairs back in order. There was, of course, the matter of the Sorceress Kingdom, but he already had a good sense of what they were after and how they could be kept at arm's length in terms of influencing Dark Dwarven policy. In fact, they were the ones that operated at arm's length in the first place when it came to their foreign relations. All of their overtures thus far suggested that they saw other polities as potential economic clients and they had next to no interest in those clients' political affairs so long as they didn't run afoul of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's regional goals. To Khazar, which almost exclusively kept to itself and its own sphere of influence, it was a highly workable scenario. The reserved stance of the Sorceress Kingdom's representative and the language that surrounded the terms of the undead lease lent to the impression that the Sorceress Kingdom saw each of its clients as a bundle of economic inputs and outputs, and the fact that they were not willing to invest in systemic change as far as those clients were concerned so long as their relationship remained profitable. As such, managing the Sorceress Kingdom's economic expectations of Khazar and satisfying those expectations would be key to maintaining its independence. With the Council's Western Army obliterated, he assigned most of his Dark Dwarven forces to sweep through the remainder of the Principality while he brought the undead to bear against Fielhammer Citadel. Their arrival at the central hold of the Principality confirmed what he had already suspected. Fielhammer Citadel was a colossal stalactite that dangled between the two main columns of the Principality. Its magically reinforced structure was 500 meters wide at the root and hung half again as long to the capital below it. The tip of the tapering structure was 50 meters above street level and the main method of access was through a set of lifts that took one from the city to the first gatehouse near the bottom of the citadel. From there, one would have to make their way up a long, winding ramp to the main entrance near the top of the citadel. The new occupants had, of course, raised the lifts. This normally resulted in an impossible obstacle to overcome, as attackers would be limited to whatever they could deliver to the fortifications above via flight magic. Any powerful individuals sent up to take control of the lifts would be met by an equivalent force plus the army supporting them. Unfortunately, this only applied when it was one clan against a handful of rival clans that somehow fought their way up to the city layer. The overwhelming and swift retaliation sent by the council also meant that an overwhelming number of heroes could be sent against the citadel to take control of the lifts, and this, by all appearances, was what happened. Felagrim looked up at the gatehouse and its lifts. What do you see up there, Deepingstone? Place is filled with defenders, Daerga replied. Looks like they captured the artillery emplacements intact. Well, that's a problem, Felagrim crossed his arms in thought. The Death Knights did not have any issues defending against the artillery deployed against them before, one of the elder lich sergeants noted. That's because they were essentially field works, Felagrim replied. They're made mundane because they don't have a long life expectancy. The best one can do is try to enhance their performance with enchanted bolts and alchemical rounds. Permanent emplacements like the ones above us are powerful pieces of equipment. Combined with the ammunition that they use and a highly experienced artillery crew, The Death Knights will get cut to pieces in no time.
In that case, the Elder Lich said, what are your orders?
His eyes went past the front gate, following the ramp as it spiraled up the citadel.
Velgarth,
he said,
have they made any big changes to the defense scheme?
Nothing's changed that's required it, his daughter replied.
Then we'll skip the entire gauntlet,
Valkyrie said. We'll fly the undead up to hit the main gate directly. A gross overextension like that would normally see a hero isolated and overwhelmed, but that didn't apply when one had over 3 dozen beings of similar strength.
If we do that, Velgarth said, most of us will still be stuck on the ground.
We can use those summons, can't we? Valkyrie jerked a thumb over his shoulder. They've gotten damn huge and they can still fly. After subsuming the bones of the Council's forces on Fielhammer, some of the lesser graveyards had grown large enough to fill the volume of several large buildings. The Elder Liches turned to regard their summons, which started changing shape as they figured out how to fulfill Valkyrie's intent. Eventually, they settled on shaping them like ships. Valkyrie boarded the largest one using a bone ramp that extended out of its side and looked over the railing at the others.
Flying on a vessel fashioned out of the bones of your enemies, he said.
Not a bad way to travel. Once his escort and the undead forces boarded their respective transports, the lesser graveyard slowly rose into the air. The floodlights from the citadel followed their ascent. Those siege engines have a range of over 1 kilometer, he said. Keep us well away from them until we need to make our approach. The lesser graveyards drifted further away from the citadel. Their ascent was slow in general, though it was still far faster than trying to fight their way up conventionally.
We need some eyes on the main gate, Valkyrie said.
The Death Priests can summon as well, right?
In response,
a few sets of wraiths materialized over the deck.
They were sent out in the direction of the citadel,
but their efforts weren't as successful as he had hoped. The alertness level of the opposing forces proving to be problematic, an Elder Lich sergeant reported. Our reconnaissance elements are being intercepted on their approach to the target area. Intercepted by what? Projectile attacks. The profile matches those of crossbow quarrels. Distance? Between 300 and 400 meters to the target structure. Valkyrie looked over at Daerga. What do you think? I'm thinking that the commander-in-chief of the council armies kept all of the strongest forces to themselves, Daerga replied. Given the nature of the punitive campaign against Clan Fielhammer, that only made sense. It was less of a military venture and more of a political one, and how their forces deployed reflected the political landscape of Khazar. Iron Fist was clearly on its way out. He wasn't sure if the prince was just getting too old or he had simply been outmaneuvered, but seeing him on the fringes of the principality laying siege to a minor hold wasn't something that would have happened in the past. The girl leading the Western army was probably placed in a similar position to keep her from gaining too much acclaim with Khazar at large. The lion's share of the spoils and renown went to the faction with the greatest political power and thus the influence to place themselves in a favorable position with the best forces. It was only when the situation turned dire for the council that Iron Fist and the girl were conveniently recognized for their talent and put in command of their ad hoc armies. Was Khazar always like this? It was always a place of treachery and intrigue, to be sure, but he wasn't sure that it was always so impractical. The present state of the principalities probably had something to do with the Holdfast faction and Clan Dirge-Hall rising to prominence. Valkyrie shook his head to clear his thoughts. Those musings helped little with the obstacle presented before them. The slow speed of the encumbered lesser graveyards meant that they were in very real danger of being knocked out of the air before arriving at their destination. Well, I never expected a flawless victory, anyway, Valkyrie said. What do you have in mind? Daerga asked. Just going back to the old-fashioned way of doing things, Valkyrie answered. We'll sacrifice some of our troops to make the landing. I volunteer, Uncle Daerga, Velgarth said. Hey. We'll need more than that, Valkyrie said, turning to an Elder Lich sergeant. Can the lesser graveyards function as shields? They can, the Elder Lich replied. However, an increase in size does not equate to an increase in durability. The summons will perish just as quickly as they would in their original form. What will happen to all the bones that they ate? While they will no longer be subject to the control of the lesser graveyard, they will also not vanish along with it. Great. Consolidate the crews. Reshape all of the unoccupied lesser graveyards into shields and layer them in front of us. We're going into that landing at full speed. The lesser graveyards drew together as the undead moved to carry out Falagrim's orders. All of the least undead boarded his vessel while the 11 other summons formed their multi-layered defense in front of them.
Your forces await your command, one of the Elder Lich sergeants said.
Full speed ahead, Falagrim said. Make sure our shields don't get too far ahead of us. No sense of acceleration accompanied them as they slowly drifted their way forward. They were picking up speed, however, and soon the sounds of quarrels and ballista bolts striking the lesser graveyard at the fore filled the air with their racket. Within seconds, the first lesser graveyard was destroyed, sending a wall of bones sloughing off to disappear into the darkness below.
That was quick, Velgarth said.
Will we make it? We will, Falagrim told her. That attack was preloaded. The sound of projectiles striking their makeshift shields diminished as the defenders stopped to reload. Their second shield shattered 20 seconds later. Distance? Falagrim shouted over the clattering cacophony. 300 meters, an Elder Lich sergeant replied. Looks like we'll have plenty of shields to spare, Falagrim said. Send 4 lesser graveyards in to disperse their attacks. Keep announcing distance to target. 250 meters. Another lesser graveyard broke apart just after the 200-meter mark. The ramp leading up the side of the stalactite appeared below them at 150 meters. Slow us down if you can, Falagrim called out, but not too slow. Death Knights, once we make the incandescent blue light blinded him as a bolt of lightning thundered over the deck. Daerga and Velgarth deftly dodged the spell, but it pierced through Falagrim, Agni, an Elder Lich, and several members of his dwarven escort. 50 meters, the Elder Lich said. Son of a bitch, Falagrim roared, scratch that. When we land, transform this ship into a ramp straight to that fucking grey robe. Seconds later, they smashed into the ground in front of the gate. The attacks from the wall ceased as the defenders took cover from the tide of bones washing up against the wall. Falagrim rose to his feet, his shield held overhead as he charged. Crush these fools. Unearthly howls joined with Falagrim's battle cry as the Death Knights followed him up the rapidly forming ramp of bone. He paused for just long enough for an overeager defender at the top of the wall to send his great axe through the air in front of him, then he hooked the back of his neck with his warhammer and sent him tumbling over the battlements. Fireballs blossomed in his peripheral vision as the Elder Liches worked to suppress the dwarves defending the other sections of the fortification. Falagrim's sabatons scraped against the stone as he leapt off of the ramp and onto the wall. He sent a glare at his surroundings, taking all of 2 seconds to locate his target. You. He pointed his warhammer at the entrance of the gatehouse tower. Within, 2 grey robes turned to point their fingers at him. His hammer came flying in, smashing one grey robe's head against the wall behind her. Falagrim grit his teeth as he ran forward, taking another bolt of lightning before swatting the second grey robe aside with his shield. He retrieved his warhammer and split the stunned caster's head open. A third grey robe poked his head down the stairwell. Then she shrieked as Falagrim rushed up and ended her, too. He looked around for any other grey robes that might have been the source of the first bolt of lightning before gazing out over the parapet of the tower at the crescent-shaped sequence of walls and towers. Hold the battlements and the gate, his voice carried over the expanding battlefield. Don't let a single one of those vermin escape. Sets of Death Knights stormed over the stone fortifications, overwhelming any and all of the defenders' attempts to regain control of the chaos. One of the surviving lesser graveyards had completely engulfed one of the towers, sending snake-like tendrils of bone into the arrow slits to devour the dwarves within. 5 minutes later, Agni, Daerga and Velgarth joined him atop the gatehouse. Injuries? Agni asked. Nothing serious, Falagrim answered. What are our casualties? 7 5th-tier summons, the cleric replied, and some singed dark dwarves. You didn't give the council any chance to muster an effective defense. Then let's keep moving, Falagrim said. I can't wait to see who has their ass planted on my throne. Once his forces assembled at the inner gate, he gestured to the arrow slits above either side of the gate. There's a walkway behind each of those arrow slits, he said. They run all the way along either side of the Hall of the Ancestors. The council will have snipers and casters positioned to ambush us as we break in. Send our wraiths through there at the same time we force the door open. Also, It looks like they've settled on using electrical attacks. Get protection energy, electricity on our vanguard. Falagrim placed a gauntleted hand on the enchanted adamantite doors, issuing its password through his thoughts. The portal glowed dimly before swinging open. Go. The vanguard of Death Knights charged into a storm of enchanted quarrels and electrospheres. Above them, the dominated Wraith forces flowed through the wall, quickly suppressing the attacks coming from above. Falagrim walked in slowly after the expanding wave of undead rolled through the hall, facing the grim gazes of his ancestors for the first time in over a century. He wondered what they thought about the whole turn of events. "Father," Velgarth called from behind him. "What is it? You should come and see this." He frowned over his shoulder at his daughter, who was still standing at the entrance to the hall. "What am I looking at?" "Not in here," she said. "Outside." He stomped out of the hall, following Velgarth back to the top of the tower gate. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the cause of his daughter's concern. Smoldering orange light danced in the distance, too far north to be on Fylhammer. "Grimmantle is burning," Velgarth said. Falagrim smirked. The day just kept getting better and better. 19th day, Upper Fire Month, 1 CE. Florian stopped to frown at the walls of bones framing the main gate of Fylhammer Citadel. Blood dripped from the machicolations from which the arms and legs of dead dark dwarves occasionally stuck out. Heavy footfalls rang in grim cadence as pairs of Death Knights patrolled the walls, turning the scene as a whole into one of what most people would probably recognize as somewhere between pure evil and absolute evil. She held in a sigh as the two Death Knights at the gate offered her a crisp salute. It wasn't the sort of place where a glowing welcome reflected well on its recipient. "You missed all of the fun," Velgarth's voice came from the shadows of the gate. "I'm glad to see that you're well, Lady Velgarth," Florian said. "Lady Velgarth, huh? Was that not the proper form of address?" "Technically, it isn't wrong," Velgarth said, "but we're not sticklers about that sort of thing. If anything, it indicates who the valuable targets are to anyone within earshot." Florian looked past Velgarth to the corpse-strewn entry hall. "Do you even have any enemies left?" At some point in the battle, she couldn't stand watching Falagrim systematically butcher people any longer, so she retreated to rest in the underway base. When she got up again, he was still at it, and it didn't seem that his bloodthirst wouldn't be sated until every single invader in the principality had been slain. "I'm sure there are at least a few somewhere," Velgarth replied. "My father's in the Great Hall if that's who you're looking for." The dwarf woman straightened from the wall and led Florian further in. Florian stared up at the lifelike granite statues lining the way. "Who are these people?" she asked. "Ancestors," Velgarth answered. "They go all the way back to when we settled Kazanah. Do your people venerate their ancestors in some way?" Perhaps the only redeeming trait of the Dark Dwarves was that they had strong familial bonds, at least until one realized that it was something grounded in practicality rather than any emotional sense. The clan was the mostly stable foundation upon which every Dark Dwarf built their life in a world where pretty much everyone else was considered an enemy. "Not really," Velgarth said. "They're just there. I have no idea who started it." Velgarth led Florian deeper into the citadel, through a series of blood-spattered grand corridors lined with dark dwarves in various states of dismemberment. At the end of them was a huge set of open double doors. Florian's already churning stomach took a turn for the worse upon hearing the grunts and moans of pain that accompanied her entrance to the great hall of Clan Fylhammer. To either side of the long carpet leading to the far end, dark dwarves were being tortured in a variety of ways, many of which she couldn't understand but horrified her nonetheless. She did her best to keep her gaze away from them as she made her way to the foot of the throne of dark granite at the head of the hall. "Prince Fylhammer," she lowered her head in a curtsy. "Congratulations on your successful reconquest of Fylhammer Citadel." "I'm sure you already knew that it was simply a matter of time," the prince replied. "A stateroom has been prepared for you. I hope you don't mind the smell." She wasn't sure if there was any point in asking about it. Her eyes left the throne, going over to the bodies of two brutally tortured dark dwarves beside it. Were they trophies that he simply wanted to look down at now and then? Since dark dwarves considered slavery a craft, maybe they considered torture one, as well. "My wife, Ba'awin," he answered her unspoken question. "And my son, Uldan. They were already dead when I arrived, The head of the council forces had them on display as trophies. Despite Falagrim being such a horrible person, a pang of sympathy twisted Florian's insides. She looked away from the bodies with teary eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Prince Fieldhammer." "Huh? What are you talking about? This saves me the trouble of going looking for them." Florian blinked, turning a blank expression up at the prince. "We have this convenient thing called resurrection magic," he told her. "You may have heard of it." "Oh. Stupid me worrying about stupid him." A particularly loud scream to the side sent her stomach back to its previously queasy state. "Might I know what your plans for the near future are, Your Highness?" She swallowed. "I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that the least undead cannot be used for expansionary objectives." "I'm well aware," the dwarf lord replied. "Grimmantle can burn for as long as they like. I don't intend on lifting a finger to help them." "Burn?" Prince Fieldhammer cast a dubious look at her. "Did you somehow not notice the entire northern horizon on fire?" "No, Your Highness." The range of her dark vision item was only 20 meters, so she had to be continuously alert for things that came into sight so she could react to them in time. She had lost count of the number of times she had nearly been run over by something in Khazanar. "Well, now you do," the prince said. "I was going to say that it wasn't us sending the undead against them." "Then who is responsible?" "Could be a few things. Those armies the council sent over came from somewhere. Starting trouble while they're away from home is common sense for anyone that's aiming to weaken their rivals' positions. I assumed that the council would have measures in place to ensure that something like this wouldn't happen to the participants." "Technically, they do," Prince Fieldhammer shrugged. "But a law is only as effective as the ability to enforce it. And the ability of the council to enforce its laws was contingent on the martial power and political will of its members. It was much like Riestais, in certain key aspects. The power of the crown rested in the contributions of its vassals, and the power of those vassals rested in the contributions of their vassals. This led to a system of checks and balances where the crown and the aristocratic elite were held accountable by the will of the establishment, but the concept of fostering mutually beneficial relationships between principalities or just playing nice didn't seem to exist in Dark Dwarf society. The Council of Khazanar was merely a tool that every clan sought to gain influence over to further their own ends. So now that Clan Fieldhammer has definitively proven that the council cannot enforce its will upon it, what happens? "Good question," Prince Fieldhammer said. "They'll be sour about getting thrashed for a few centuries, at least, so I figure that Clan Fieldhammer will exist independently from the rest of Khazanar, and that's a good thing, as far as your goals are concerned." "How so?" "First of all, since the council is no longer capable of suppressing Clan Fieldhammer's activities, it means that we don't have to trade in slaves anymore. I believe that's something you were pushing for." "Yes, Your Highness," Florine nodded. "But isn't your economy dependent on slaves?" "What gave you that idea?" The prince frowned. "Well, that's beside the point anyway. Since the council's interference is no longer a thing, we can go back to raiding the surrounding region for slaves. The restoration of our sphere of influence will also mean increased demand for your undead security forces, so I'm sure your superiors will be pleased with the developments." "I see." Florine had no doubt that he was correct. Prince Fieldhammer was undoubtedly a lord with his demonstrated degree of acumen as a ruler. All he did was occasionally interact with Florine and read over the Sorcerous Kingdom's laws to develop a good enough sense of the Sorcerous Kingdom that he could predict how they would react to his activities. The Sorcerous Kingdom's royal court would consider their new relationship with Clan Fieldhammer a success both in the sense that they were a new outlet for undead security forces and the promising new economic ties that they represented. It didn't matter that the goods being traded were in part or in whole the product of slave labor. The low-maintenance relationship was one where the Sorcerous Kingdom stood to gain on every front, as far as they knew. A collection of steps sounded from behind them, and Florine looked over her shoulder to find Agni accompanied by what appeared to be a pair of religious attendants. They were garbed in dark vestments with unfamiliar iconography, and one of them carried a black metal casket between his hands. "My prince," Agni said, "we've made our preparations." "Get on with it," Prince Fieldhammer said. Agni turned and lifted the lid of the casket, which was filled with glittering diamonds. She grabbed a fistful of them and dumped them on Baowen's corpse. Raised dead. Most of the diamonds dematerialized. While the horrific wounds left by Ba'awin's torture mended themselves, Agony leaned forward to pick up the few diamonds that hadn't disappeared, tossing them back into the casket. Eh? Surely that wasn't it. Ba'awin's eyes popped open. You're late, she said. I don't recall saying that I'd come around at all, Prince Philhammer replied. The dwarf woman sat up, peering around the great hall. What happened to the invaders? She asked. Dead or dying, the prince said. We're clearing out harder now. Good. Ba'awin rose to her feet, snatching a simple robe proffered by one of the attendants and putting it on before walking out of the great hall. Where did she go? Florine asked. Where else? Prince Philhammer answered, back to work. Raised dead. Uldan sat up with a grunt, rising to his feet before storming out of the hall. Where are you going, son? Prince Philhammer said. Work, Uldan said without stopping. See? Prince Philhammer told her. This is all wrong. Where was the touching reunion between family members? Never mind being separated for over a century, they had literally died. Then, there was the resurrection service. The resurrection of the dead was supposed to be a near-legendary blessing that was treated with the utmost reverence and the appropriate rites. What she just witnessed was a service in the sparest sense of the word. It was as if Agni was handing out a scoop of ice cream in the most backhanded way possible. She didn't even know that Agni was a fifth-tier divine caster. Everyone just treated her like the resident priest. Is something the matter? Prince Philhammer asked. No, Florine sighed. If you're weary from your ordeals, the prince told her, you're free to go and rest in your stateroom. Velgarth will attend to you. Velgarth made a face. Huh? You heard me, Prince Philhammer said. You're around the same age, relatively speaking. Go and do whatever young women do. I don't think she hates anyone enough for that, Velgarth grumbled. My prince, a guard came walking up the carpet. Lord Gorost has arrived. Bring him in, Prince Philhammer ordered. Velgarth, take our guest here and show her whatever she came with us for. I'd rather not start out having the lords think that a human has me on a leash. Velgarth led Florine out of the great hall and into a corridor that led deeper into the citadel. They stopped suddenly and it took Florine a few moments to realize that they were standing in front of a door that looked like it was a part of the wall. You can throw your things in here, my lady, Velgarth told her. Put some guards up, if you want. She opened the door and Florine stepped inside. Everything was, of course, dwarf-sized. She had to duck to fit herself and Leolio under the door frames between each of the chambers. Between the dwarves, Vubibi, and Leolio, she would have felt like a giant if it wasn't for the Death Knights waddling around on their knees behind her. Do you receive guests often? Florine asked. Not really, Velgarth answered. The lords of the different holds come around once in a while, but we haven't had any guests from outside Philhammer for over a century. I've been meaning to ask about that, Florine said. Khazanah was described as a group of principalities, but I wasn't sure how to frame them. Both territorially and politically. Would I be correct to describe each principality as something like a city-state? In many ways, the political configuration of Khazanah was similar to the city-state alliance of Karnassus. The Baharuth Empire's neighbor consisted of a collection of duchy-sized territories, each containing a major city that acted as the political and economic capital of that territory. Each city-state claimed to inherit the spirit and will of its predecessor, a great nation that was known as Karnassus, which had shattered due to the demon god's rampage 2 centuries previous. It was this inheritance that facilitated the existence of the city-state alliance, though the relationship between each city-state couldn't exactly be described as harmonious. The same history that brought them together to defend their collective heritage against the frequent incursions from the Great Steppe was also the main divisive factor, as each city-state claimed to be the true successor of Karnassus' legacy. There were two main practical differences between Karnassus and Khazanah. The first was that the principalities of Khazanah were less restrained in the competitive measures that they enacted. The second was that Khazanah's population was far greater due to the realities of the realms below. She wouldn't be surprised if someone told her that there were more denizens in Khazanah than there were humans in Riastais, Baharuth, and Roble combined. I don't know what you have in mind when you say city-state, my lady, Velgarth replied, but you can treat each principality as a sovereign territory in its own right. And where does each hold within a principality sit from an organizational standpoint?
They're the sub-clans under Clan Feelhammer. The big cadet branches.
There are 12 holds, and each hold governs one of the 12 territories of the principality. It didn't sound much different from how aristocratic dynasties worked.
So, wait, you said that there were 12 holds for the 12 territories. But I thought that there were 13 holds including Feelhammer Citadel. What about it? Which territory does your family preside over? The entire principality, your worship.
Did that mean the ruling family was entirely reliant on its aristocratic vassals for income?
She hadn't ever heard of such a thing.
How much power does the prince of a principality have over his subjects? Florine asked.
As much as he needs, Velgarth answered. But what keeps the prince's power in check? Common sense, your inquisitorial excellency.
It's all right to call me Florine in private,
you know.
And didn't you say that addressing someone like that marked them as a target?
Sure did.
Florine leveled a flat look at Velgarth.
The dwarf woman returned her look.
She's doing it in private, so maybe she's just teasing?
It would be nice if it's a sign of her warming up to me. I wonder what would happen if I handled her like Liane. It was probably inappropriate. Velgarth was a daughter of a prince, after all.
So what are your duties now that Feelhammer has been retaken, Lady Velgarth? Attending to you, Lady Gagne. What I meant was, what would you normally be doing in this situation?
Rooting out spies, Velgarth said.
Is it so easy for members of one clan to blend in with another?
No, but slaves are a different story.
Could a slave be sent to spy on their master's enemies? Spies were generally either motivated by loyalty or self-interest, and it didn't seem as if a slave would have any of the former,
nor would they be afforded the luxury of the latter.
Then again, she didn't know how the Dark Dwarves ran their slave empire. It reminded her that it was one of the things she had come to learn about. When will it be safe to take a look around Carsonar? Florine asked.
I'd like to see what it's like when the streets aren't embroiled in violence.
With that escort of yours,
Velgarth answered, it would be safe to take a look around even if the streets were embroiled in violence.
I'm afraid that the presence of the undead might interfere with the people's daily lives.
No more than your usual companions would.
If you want to keep things from getting too crowded, just them would suffice.
I see, Florine said. Just give me a moment while I unpack my things. She handed her infinite haversack over to the vampire bride. In addition to examining their system of slavery, Florine wanted to examine Dark Dwarf society as a whole. Their behavior suggested that it should have been absurdly dysfunctional, yet they seemed to be thriving despite their bleak and belligerent outlook. Florine went over to the row of arrow slits along the back wall of her suite to see what sort of view it offered. For the first time, she noticed the orange glow lighting the cavern in the distance. Florine wished she had a set of the goggles that the Empire's reconnaissance units employed.
What do you suppose is happening over there? She asked.
Your father didn't seem concerned at all about it.
I overheard some talk from a few council officers about Grimmantle betraying them.
Velgarth came over and looked out of a different arrow slit. My guess is that the council sent a punitive force to deal with them.
Does the council have so many armies at its disposal that it can attack both Feelhammer and Grimmantle?
They had way more than we expected, that's for sure. But with a good portion of Grimmantle's forces here, the council would need fewer people to attack Grimmantle than Feelhammer. They may have just sent a bunch of heroes to mess the place up, considering it sounded like they just found out. Moving an army would take far longer. But what would they betray Carsonar for? Florine frowned. Clan Feelhammer claims self-defense, but I don't know enough about the other clans to figure out why Grimmantle would do something like that. They think that Grimmantle sold Carsonar out to the Sorceress Kingdom. Florine turned her gaze from the arrow slit to stare incredulously at Velgarth. The dwarf woman's eyes gleamed as a sadistic smile crept onto her expression. They thought that the undead were let into Carsonar by Grimmantle, Velgarth told her. They also believe that Grimmantle sent scouts and commanders to coordinate them. Everything that we did, they pinned on Grimmantle. To be fair, it was a rational conclusion given the information that they had to work with. Are your people familiar with the concept of confirming information before acting upon it? And how would they do that? Velgarth asked. Wait 2 weeks while a runner is sent to your office in the Abelian Hills to confirm that your Death Knights are butchering everyone in Carsonar at the behest of Grimmantle? Not that the runner would have anyone to report to by the time they got back. Ugh, why does the world have to be like this? In addition to how readily misapprehensions, misinformation, and malicious rumors could spread, it was shockingly easy to forget just how slow communications and logistics were outside of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. A country could go through a short war before refugees from said country brought word of its plight to the country right next to it. News wasn't guaranteed to travel anywhere at all, and, even if it did, it wasn't guaranteed to be accurate. More often than not, it was the merchant guild that was the first to carry what was considered trustworthy information from one country to another, as it tended to operate on purely commercial motives. Once her office was set up, they left the stateroom to begin their tour of the city below. On the way out of the entry hall, however, they crossed paths with Law, who was on his way in. "What did you find out?" Velgarth asked. The dark dwarf ranger answered with a jerk of his head, gesturing to the hall ahead of him with his beard. Florian and Velgarth fell into step behind him as he made his way to the great hall. "Your people don't seem to be much for social decorum," Florian said. "Replying to a sovereign's daughter like that would be unthinkable in human society." "Huh? Why's that?" "Because they're the sovereign's daughter? Never mind a sovereign, even the children of a minor aristocrat wouldn't experience that sort of treatment." "I still don't get it," Velgarth said. Florian glanced at Velgarth out of the corner of her eye. "Because pointlessly antagonizing those who wield power isn't prudent," Florian said. "I get that much," Velgarth said. "But why would it matter any more for the child of an aristocrat than it would anyone else? Because, for instance, if one angers the son of an aristocrat, that anger may be turned against them when the son becomes the head of the house, if not sooner. It doesn't even have to be an aristocrat, to be honest. A workshop employee won't risk angering the children of the workshop owner out of fear of being dismissed, nor would an artisan cross the children of their guildmaster." "So you're saying that humans don't cross the kids of humans in charge because their kids eventually become the boss? Are you implying that kids inherit the clan or business or whatever just because they're the kid of the last person in charge?" "Yes, that's right," Florian replied. Velgarth shook her head in disgust. "Is that not how it works here?" Florian asked. "It's not how it works in any place that has the slightest bit of good sense," Velgarth answered. "So, if some human kid is an utter fool, they still get to be in charge if they're the kid of the person in charge? Well, any fee-for organization isn't run by just one person, but that's the general idea." The dwarf woman scoffed. "Hey Law, can you imagine getting stuck under some idiot for 400 years? "I'd move to harder if that happened," Law replied. "Then how does the matter of succession handled in Kazana?" Florian asked. "The clan votes on the next leader," Velgarth said. "And the next leader is voted in because they're deemed the most qualified to lead the clan in its present circumstances." "But didn't your mother rule in your father's stead?" "My mother ruled because she was voted in after my father was exiled. My father married my mother because she was the most qualified woman to help him rule." "Is it like that for everything here?" "Of course it is," Velgarth told her. "Look, I figured that you humans do it the way you do because you think that breeding matters. You're not wrong, but breeding isn't consistent. That's why any society that has any idea what they're doing has a large pool of candidates to select the best possible person in any given generation. It drastically mitigates the likelihood of one idiot burning the entire civilization to the ground. Humanoid leadership is so complicated," Booby sighed. "Don't you suffer attrition from competition between candidates? If humans used a system like that, it wouldn't be uncommon for factions to throw their resources into undermining one another to secure coveted positions instead of focusing on managing their holdings well. At worst, one would see assassinations and destructive interference would spill over into broader society. Picking off competent people is something you do to your enemies. Only short-sighted idiots do it to themselves. Since humans only live for 3 years or something, I suppose it can't be helped that you think that way." The aroma of burnt hair and roasted meat wafted out to greet them before they entered the great hall of Fielhammer Citadel. Roughly a third of the dwarves being tortured were being replaced with fresh ones. Those who had died lay in plain view of the instruments that they had succumbed to. "My prince," Law saluted at the foot of the Dark Throne. "The first set of scouts have returned from Grimmantle with their reports." "Let's hear it," Prince Fielhammer said. "It's not just Grimmantle,"
the Dark Dwarf Ranger said. Axhold, Shadowforge, Dark Steel, and Gloom Granite are burning, as well. We flew scouts further out to see what's going on in the rest of Karzanar. Prince Feelhammer leaned back on his throne, crossing his arms with a humph. Did everyone just conveniently decide to turn on one another at the same time?
No, Law shook his head. As far as we can tell, it's an invasion. Going by some of the races that we spotted, the invaders are from the Middle Realms.
Low, pained laughter rose from one of the tortured dark dwarves nearby.
Enjoy your victory while you can, Feelhammer. You'll be dead along with the rest of us, soon.
Seems my first guess about why that council army was so damn huge was right on the mark, Prince Feelhammer said.
Tell us what you know, Dirgehall.
Up yours, traitor. Your lack of communication was what caused Feelhammer to turn on you in the first place, Florine said. Shouldn't you have shared what you knew about this invasion?
Why?
So they could stab us in the back at the opportune time. You picked the wrong clan to side with, Overlander.
Fala boy.
Daerga burst into the great hall, stopping after 2 steps.
Oh, looks like Law beat me to it, he said. That depends on what you have to say, Prince Feelhammer said.
The red-bearded dwarf lord strolled up to the dais.
Karzanar's under attack by a gazer hive. Then Law didn't beat you to it, Prince Feelhammer replied. How many principalities are under attack?
Every single damn one, Daerga said.
They're getting their asses handed to them.
Prince Feelhammer raised a gauntleted hand to stroke his beard thoughtfully.
I suppose I should fill out another order form, he said after a moment.
Can the Sorcerer's Kingdom deliver more undead just as quickly as before?
Yes, Your Highness, Florine replied.
Good, Prince Feelhammer said,
then turned to the officers attending him to the side. Put Feelhammer on high alert.
Incorporate the undead into our defense scheme and prioritize readying our anti-air defenses.
Update the forces cleaning up harder, as well. I don't want those damn things popping out of the tunnels there.
Will you be deploying forces to aid Karzanar? Florine asked. While she couldn't rejoice at the turn of events, it did at least provide an opportunity for the Dark Dwarves to band together in common cause and reconcile their past grievances.
Of course not, Prince Feelhammer snorted. They deserve everything that's happening to them.
Please do enjoy your tour of the capital while we await their eradication.